Please join me in welcoming Hilary Hungerford.
Welcome, everyone. I have a lot of pictures today, and hopefully they all work. It's so nice to see familiar faces and new ones too. We're going to go on kind of a long, winding journey today, but stay with me because I think it's going to be interesting. First, thanks to the Center for Study of Ethics for putting on this awesome week, inviting me to be a part of it. And I know it's a huge effort, so thanks to all your staff and all the effort. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about work that I've done for the last 20 years, which feels wild to say, but when I was putting together the talk, I was like, oh my gosh, 20 years. That's serious. So here is where we will be going today, through Earth's dry lands. First, we're going to stop in Niamey, Niger, which is the country highlighted in Africa. And then we'll be going to Utah, and then we will be going to Mongolia. So in each of these places, we'll explore questions of water access, trees, sustainable urbanism, and kind of broadly global urban policy. And this really tracks my development and thinking about these issues over the last 20 years. Okay, so the first stop we're going to is Niamey, Niger. Niamey is the capital of Niger, a country in the West African Sahel that's about 80% covered by the Sahara Desert. About 25 million people live in Niger, and it has the highest birth rate in the world, so that number is only going to grow. It also has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the world, with the average person earning about $700 a year. So it's a really challenging place to live for a lot of people. So for Niamey itself, the population estimates vary so widely, from 700,000 all the way to 5 million, because there is no regular census. And that's something, as geographers or earth science, we use census data a lot to try to plan cities and understand the way things work. But in so many places of the world, there's just no regular census. So we're going to settle in the middle and say it's about 3 million people live in Niamey. And this is a city without a central sewer network. It doesn't have a lot of networked infrastructure. And only about half of the people living there have access to water. Oh, I think I skipped a slide. Okay. So this is where the story starts. So this was my PhD research. I was just a young little PhD student looking at water access in the city. I got really interested in ideas of environmental justice, especially water access in the global south, particularly in urban areas, because you can't just really dig wells in urban areas because groundwater is usually pretty polluted, so you have to have some sort of networked infrastructure like water pipes. They're super expensive. So many places in the world, these are not a thing. And probably you didn't even think about it today, like turning on your faucet, brushing your teeth, you didn't even think about it. But it's a real luxury for so many people in the world. So during my PhD, I was actually there on a Fulbright scholarship also, and the city had about 2 million people at the time. And about half of them did not have water still, about the same today, still about half. So I spent my time exploring the city, selecting neighborhoods to study, interviewing people at the water company, government officials, and working with other academics. So these were kind of my central questions here. And together with colleagues in Niger, we selected 25 neighborhoods across the city and did 25 households in each city, kind of a random, stratified, random sampling. So I talked to a lot of people about how they access water. I spent so many days wandering around the city, and these are just kind of some snapshots of how people access water when they don't have it. And we'll get to a little bit of those stories later, but I want you to pay attention to these yellow water jugs, because those are going to enter the story later. So if people don't have water, they usually have to go to some public water point and get water and then take it back home. And if you've ever been hiking, you know that water is super heavy. And a lot of times this is women and children's work. So there becomes a lot of inequities around like women's work, education opportunities, depending on gender. And it's all because people don't have water inside of their houses. So when I was doing this work, I also got really interested in trees in the city. So I learned so much about water access, but really I learned about the power of trees and the usefulness of trees. And this was a picture I took on one of my many survey days of just this beautiful tree in a neighborhood that I sat under for a long time. And shade trees are so important in this particular place. It's in the hot season, it's about 120 degrees every day for like 2 months or so. In the cool season, it only gets up to the mid-90s during the day. So it's really hot. Oh, and I was also pregnant with my daughter at the time, so I was always looking for shade. I was like, where's shade? Where can I cool down? It's also under these shade trees where a lot of social life happens. It's where men and women congregate, they talk about issues important to their neighborhood. They have informal community watch that gathers under these trees during the day and during the night. And there's been some really interesting scholarship, not by me, but by others on that. It was also under the trees of the Grand Mosque of Niamey, and that's what's shown in the bottom, the courtyard of the Grand Mosque, where this was like a center of Muslim life, of religious life for a lot of people. People would sit under the trees, study all day. It was really beautiful. So I became just like so aware of the power of trees in this really hot desert environment and how they were really crucial for social and like political reproduction of life in the city. And it was under these trees that I interviewed literally hundreds and hundreds of people during my time. It was also when I traveled to the Nigerian countryside that I realized even more how special these trees in the city were. So this is a picture of just kind of an average countryside look in Niger. It's really scrubland that this was in the dry season. In the wet season, the grasses do come alive. But it's a really, really dry place. And this is like the good 20% of the country. It's a really challenging environment in a lot of ways. But trees are always there. Trees are always a center of life. They're always important in villages where people gather and exchange stories, learn about their histories, and just communicate like what it is to be living in Niger. Also, Independence Day and Arbor Day are celebrated on the same day in Niger. So trees become symbolic of national identity. And they like to plant trees like baobab trees or something that takes a really long time to grow, kind of symbolizing the longevity of the Nigerian state. So it's not by accident that they choose which trees to plant, but they really put a lot of thought and effort into it. So when I went to the countryside and came back to the city, I was blown away by how many trees there were. I was like, oh my gosh, this city is so lush compared to what exists in the countryside. And that got me thinking about this idea of an oasis. So if you know a little bit about kind of West African history or just like history in the dry lands, you know that oases are really, really important just kind of in like global history. First, the map is showing this red part is the Sahel region, and that's kind of where my PhD work occurred. And they have a lot of oases in this region. So oases are really interesting because they're natural, but they're also social and political. So in these vast swaths of the giant Sahara Desert, there are places where water is at the surface, and usually they have date farming or other types of like farming that exist in the area. So that's the picture like on the bottom right is a picture of a contemporary oasis town called Bilma, Niger. And then the bottom left and the upper right are historic ruins of some of these oasis towns dating back to like the 11th century. So really, really old towns, part of these old trans-Saharan trading networks, which before European colonization, that's where the money was to be made, was crossing the Sahara Desert. So they're natural features, but they don't exist without humans there. And humans have found amazing ways to manage resource, cultivating dates especially, but other crops. And then they have a lot of political and community organization around these. They also have really amazing architecture forms. And then also this kind of idea of an oasis as a place of refuge, a place of protection from like these vast, really difficult landscapes. So I want us to keep in mind that idea of the oasis as a place of refuge. Okay, so going back to Niamey then, Niamey really is a refuge. It's an oasis in a lot of ways. And I'll get to what I mean in terms of trees. But it's really where people of Niger want to move. It's the most important city in the country. It's the economic, political, cultural capital of this like giant country with 25 million people. People all over the world come here to access higher education. Okay, maybe not all over West Africa to access higher education. It's a place where rural migrants come and settle with the promise of opportunity. Especially farmers now kind of struggling with changing climate, increasing political violence from certain groups, and trying to figure out how they're going to subsist on subsistence agriculture that they've done for a long time, but now in this changing climate with a lot more people. So Niamey is truly an oasis, and actually during the hot season from about April to about June, the city swells with an additional 500,000-ish people. Again, it's like hard to measure, but there's this real tradition of the rural exodus during the dry season of people looking for wage labor, and they come to the city. And they live in shacks. You can see one guy with a camel there. That's like a recent migrant coming to and trying to sell whatever they can to earn a little bit of living. And you see then the kind of Niamey as this like place of refuge and opportunity. And they also have a vision for the future, which I find so interesting. And this is what's pictured on the upper right, is this kind of like urban plan for the future of Niamey, which seems just totally like out of place in some ways. It seems like such this paradise vision that would be so expensive. And it looks almost like Dubai-ish or Abu Dhabi with this river running through the middle, which there is a river, but then really focused on green infrastructure, like really kind of leaning into this oasis idea, though they might not talk about it in the same way. And there is water in Niamey, maybe not as much as other places, but there is water infrastructure. Yeah, so people move to Niamey with the promise of opportunity and this vision for the future. Okay, so back to my tree research for a minute. So yeah, when I left the countryside, and actually this was like a project after my PhD work, I got really into this idea of trees. So I was like, I'm gonna do a household survey of trees, see what people have, like why they plant the trees they do, what's the barriers to planting, what different kinds of species. And so what I found kind of unsurprisingly was people with water access have more trees in their household. So this isn't like city trees. This is like what you might plant in your yard. Yeah, so unsurprisingly, people with water, which generally means like a nicer neighborhood, more economically well off, they have trees. And they actually have more fruit trees than shade trees. The people in the poor neighborhoods without water, they tended to prioritize shade trees. I thought it was going to be the opposite, that maybe poor neighborhoods would prioritize fruit trees, but that's not what I found, which I thought was also an interesting finding. But kind of looking at this made me realize that there is just real material differences in household trees in the city. That the city was a real oasis for some people, it was a real mirage for others. It was a promise of something different and new and possible, but in reality not available to the poor, to the migrant, or to the disenfranchised. Living conditions in the city can be really harsh, with people building just kind of thatch shacks in unoccupied land, really vulnerable to displacement. And thousands of young people that move to the city are kind of left unemployed or underemployed with not a lot of opportunity. So like a good academic, this got me thinking about theory. Like, how can I take this back to what theory can help me understand this, and how do earth scientists and geographers think about this? So when I was putting together this talk, I started to try to make it more ethics. And I was like, who am I kidding? Geographers don't really talk about these things in terms of ethics. And earth scientists don't really use that language of a moral obligation. But we do talk about things, and we study a lot of the same issues. We just talk about it differently. So that's the next few slides kind of help you understand how geographers talk about these same issues. So we talk about unevenness and uneven distribution of benefits and environmental costs, social and environmental justice, and we talk a lot about shaping our future, and especially in relation to climate change. That's something that our department as a whole thinks a lot about. But we don't necessarily use the language of ethics. But for me, my kind of guiding theoretical perspective is political ecology. And this is a slide just kind of about the basics of that perspective. So I'll just kind of read these for you, and you can follow along. Okay, so this framework of political ecology really insists on the interconnectedness of social and environmental issues. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. And that's really central to most of my work. And it really highlights the environmental burdens and benefits are uneven. That's kind of the central theme of environmental justice. It also really insists on centering the rights of marginalized communities and considering historical processes that lead to the current situation, examining economic influences and interests that look at profit over people or profit over sustainability, and then really looking at the role of power in policy and adaptation strategies. And what's cool, I think, about geography is it helps connect the local and the global together. Okay, so that's just the theory part, so you kind of know my frame for which I understand a lot. Okay, on this journey, now we're coming to this very building that we're in right now. Just because that was a nice picture I could find online. So I brought all this work to UVU with me, and especially in my classes that I teach, we explore ideas together. And especially in my urban geography class, we've done a lot of work on kind of this relationship of trees and sustainability and looking at it in terms of race, socioeconomic class. And this slide here is talking about redlining, which is probably something you've all heard of. But just to give a crash course in redlining if you don't know about it. And this isn't something I've researched, but we explore these ideas in class together. So redlining, which is shown on the map here on the left. So a government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation made these maps as part of its city survey from 1935 until 1940. And these maps were designed to assess mortgage risk. So folks went in and they surveyed neighborhoods mostly on social and racial categories, and then they decided which areas were good to give mortgages, had little risk, and which areas were bad. And the red ones are the lowest in the scale, and then the green ones are the best. And these had an overt racial category to them. Neighborhoods marked as hazardous were usually, they were usually minoritized neighborhoods. Most of the time had African American communities in them. And so they really got a little investment. If you lived in these neighborhoods, you weren't allowed really to take out a mortgage. You couldn't get a mortgage to buy a house. So there was not really a lot of incentive for people to move to these areas. So it started this whole cascade of things like suburbanization, white flight out of the cities. And what's really interesting, though, is you can see how these impact cities to this very day. And this is a piece from a New York Times article that they showed the tree cover in a red-lined area on the left, and then on one of the green designated areas on the right. That's such a huge difference. And just thinking about then how that impacts residents in these places today is just like, it's wild to see that on the landscape. The practice was outlawed in 1968, so 50 years later, it's still really visible on the landscape and has real material effects on like health and children, outcomes for children. Okay, we also kind of look in my classes at sustainable urbanism, this idea of like a 15-minute city or a 5-minute city. And there's a bunch of those actually in Utah. The Daybreak community is one of those. And then the newest development, which is the Point. So if you drive to Salt Lake City on I-15, you pass where the prisons used to be. That's this huge new development called the Point, which will be a walkable 15-minute city. This is on the bottom, that's kind of what the renderings are. So that will be totally different, in the next 10 years or so. Actually, I'm gonna skip that one. Okay, so we look at these things and we're like, okay, these are great. These are really interesting city, especially this kind of 15-minute city idea. But then we see like, wow, there's really like such uneven distribution of these types of programs. They're really concentrated in wealthy areas, and sustainability often has this class associated with it. Even electric cars are priced out for a lot of people. A median home in Daybreak last year was $600,000, and that's just unattainable for a lot of people. And like, no hate if you live in Daybreak, no hate on you. It's a great place. And you can just see kind of the cascading effects then. Like, why should these spaces only be for wealthy people? Why shouldn't they be available to like the average Utahn? There's just such a high cost to green infrastructure, and environmental benefits don't often reach marginalized people. And I think it's the Point makes a really good case study, because literally you're pushing out like the marginalized people, people in prison, to build this new luxury, high development, but also cool and sustainable and like walkable. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Will I live in the Point? That's the question. Okay, so our last stop on our wild journey is where I just got back from a few months ago. And this is Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. So this is just a picture of the city skyline. This is kind of the iconic like hotel, the Blue Sky Hotel. There was a restaurant in the top of it. It was all glass. I discovered that I'm really scared of heights when I went up there. It was terrifying. But just a really iconic in the city, and you can kind of see this is at sunset, and you can see the power plant in the distance with the beautiful smoke and steam coming from it. Okay, so I get asked this question a lot, like, why did you go to Mongolia? The real answer is because I've always been interested. But then when I got to thinking about how am I going to make this argument that I should study Mongolia, I found like, wow, there's like striking similarities between Niamey and Utah and Mongolia and Ulaanbaatar. So that's what's on this slide. Just shows that, they're all located in these dryland regions, which isn't really on purpose. That just like how the life journey unfolded was that I guess now I'm interested in drylands. And each of these places have this huge booming population for different reasons, but they still have to deal with finding space for people, urban growth, and how sustainability fits into that. Niamey, for example, has grown to like 3 million people just in the last like 25 years, adding so many people all the time. And then we all know, living in the Wasatch Front, that this is a booming place too. And then Ulaanbaatar, which was surprising to me, I didn't know a lot before I went there, is also like exploding with growth. They all face challenges of sustainability, air quality, energy production, and so on. So when I went to Niger, Mongolia, I was like, I think I'm gonna study kind of similar issues that I studied in Niger. That could be interesting. And I did that because when I went to Mongolia, I learned about kind of how the city works and learned that there's this huge informal district. So as the city grows, the kind of planning office can't keep pace with development, so people just settle on the outskirts of the city. And this is an image of what these outskirts look like with kind of the urban center in the background. So this is called the Ger district, and Ger is the Mongolian word for yurt. You might know them as yurts. That's what's pictured in the foreground. And this is just one like small little part of the Ger district. But these Ger districts, they really exploded starting in the 1990s. So before then, before the 1990s, Mongolia was part of the Soviet Union. Kind of not a Soviet Socialist Republic, but they were really part of the orbit. That's when they started using the Cyrillic alphabet. They were outlawed from like using their traditional Mongolian alphabet. And they also had huge cultural transformation, political transformation. But then in the 90s, as the Soviet Union fell, they had a rapid transition to democracy and, most importantly, a market economy, which then saw lots of people kind of move to the city in search of new opportunities. It sounds so similar to what happened in Niger when they got independence from France in the 1960s, where all of a sudden there was like opportunity, new political regime, new economic regime, and people like wanted to be a part of it. So people moved to the city. And that's always what people do, right? We move, we try to like make a living, try to provide for ourselves. And usually when people move to Ulaanbaatar, this is where they settle first, the Ger district. And the Gers are really what's used in the Mongolian countryside still to this day. It's not just like a cute little traditional house, but it's really like that's what people live in if you go to the countryside. They're really portable and they're easy to move around. So if you're a migrant going to the city, you're like, it's no problem. I'll just put up my ger. As long as I can find a plot of land, I'm good. So here's another image, and I want to talk to you for a minute just about, again, this kind of idea of an urban oasis, but more like metaphorically, not literally. I don't think it works in the same way as Niger or Utah in terms of like biodiversity and stuff, but I think it still works. So the city for sure is a place of refuge. It's a place of historic preservation and like rebirth of the Mongolian identity. It has world-class universities, and amazing museums like the Genghis Khan Museum, or Genghis Khan is how we know it in the US. The Ger district is also a place of connection and a place of social life compared to these kind of high-rise apartments where most of the other people in the city live. I lived in a high-rise apartment, but actually about 60% of people in Ulaanbaatar live in the Ger district. And this is really important because half of the people in Mongolia live in Ulaanbaatar, and then the majority of those people actually live in the Ger district. So you could say of any type of kind of urban plan, this is the most common way of living in Mongolia. Also, this is a really central point for migration. So, and that's really connected with climate change. For example, in 2024, they had one of the worst winters they've had in a long time. They had something that's called a ZUD, which I was like, yes, I get to experience like one of the worst winters. How fun. It's really cold there. It's really cold. But in a ZUD, that means there's just high snowfall. So it was the highest snowfall in almost 50 years. And then just really cold temperatures prolonged for a long time. So this means that livestock, they couldn't get down to the grasses to eat that they were used to. It wasn't the temperatures necessarily that killed livestock, but it was that they couldn't get down to the grasses that they need. And 10% of the country's livestock died. So you can imagine families lost their whole herds. And for people living in the countryside, this is really like how they make their living, is off livestock. And I did not take these pictures, but the pictures on the bottom, you can just see one family, like how much snow they had to shovel a path to their gare, and then they have a nice herd of sheep that are still well taken care of. But on the upper right, and you would see this when you would drive in the countryside in the winter, you just see piles of livestock. So people kind of put them in a central place. And I mean, that represents like the loss of their entire livelihood. And so it's estimated that just this year, about 25,000 people moved to the city because of a direct result of like losing their whole livelihood. And they settle in the Gare district, maybe with families, but more often in the Gare district. So this might be kind of hard to see, but I'm gonna try to show you. So on the bottom, you can kind of see, this is a satellite image of the city. And on the bottom, you can kind of see the like apartments and more like urban center. Can you all see that? And then on the top, you just kind of see like some little peppered type developments. That's all Gare district. So it's huge. It's so much bigger than kind of the central like downtown area or the area where the apartments are. They're so huge. I'm just gonna this is like mind-blowing to me. I'm just gonna give you a minute to look at this. Okay, so more about my research I did. So I decided, okay, I want to learn about water in this area because they're not hooked up to the networked water infrastructure. And they have really different challenges, but climate extremes. So the picture on the bottom is my son, Elmer. He got to do some research with me. And on the top left is my research assistant. She's a brilliant Mongolian student because I don't speak Mongolian. And then look at these water jugs. Don't they look so similar to what we saw in Niger? Like the same thing. That's my next project, I think. Okay, so for my research on water access, I did kind of similar things that I did in Niamey, but I didn't try to get at the same scale. And I just wanted to interview people, but I found that there was a lot of cultural differences in like talking to people and approaching people and how uninterested really people were in talking with me about water issues. When I did this work in Niger, it was really easy. You can just knock on someone's door, they invite you in, you have tea, it's amazing, you talk, it's great. But here, really not the same. A lot of people in the Gare district have dogs for protection, so there was like giant wild dogs everywhere, which terrified me. So just like that also fascinated me how different this research looked just because of cultural context. So what we did was we connected with some different NGOs, and then they kind of connected us with some of their clients that they provide services to in the district. So that's why my sample size is a little bit smaller here, but we were able to do some really nice in-depth interviews. And these are just the 3 NGOs that I mostly worked with. So here's kind of a close-up of what the Gare district looks like. So it's actually a real mixture of people living in gares, people living in houses. But none of these places are connected to the central water network. So what people do is they go to kiosks, and a lot of them actually drive. And the kiosks have regular working hours. If you have a car or access to it, a lot of times it's the men or adult men that go. But if you don't have a car and you're walking, it's usually children or women. And most of the time on the weekends, these places were packed. And I hung out at a lot of these places and tried to interview people or see if they wanted to talk. But I really just observed what was going on. And this is just a really common sight. People lining up for water, waiting, depending on the time of day, maybe waiting an hour or maybe just 30 minutes. So the kiosks are all serviced by trucks. Trucks come to fill up the water, and there's someone working in the kiosk that calls the truck and is like, hey, we're almost out of water. So they come, but there's also terrible traffic, so a lot of times they're late. So the kiosks don't regularly have water. There's so many times where they run out of water, and people have to walk, to another kiosk, or they just have to wait, or maybe they have to buy bottled water. So the costs really, really add up. Also during the winter, the women have to make sure they have a fire going all night so the water pipes don't freeze. So this is a really, really demanding job for people in the winter time. So in Niger, the biggest challenges to water is that the kiosks run out of water. And you can imagine transporting water in the winter when the roads are icy is really difficult. And then it just takes so much time, so much time. Okay, so like a good academic, when you're doing research, you always find other questions that you want to explore. The first, I think my next project is going to be why are those yellow jugs? Why does everyone use those yellow jugs everywhere in the world? What? They're old cooking containers. Where do they come from? That's what I want to do next. And also just why is the water system so similar? Why do the solutions, the sustainable city solutions, why are they basically identical in these two different places that have such different context? Spoiler alert, it's all because of international aid organizations. But I haven't done that research yet, but I'm almost sure that's what it is. But I really learned a lot when I was there about heating. And because you can imagine that was something I thought a lot about there when it was so cold. So I'm going to talk to you just a minute about that because I know we're short on time. So here's a picture that I took standing in the Gare district with the power plants in the distance. So Ulaanbaatar runs off of coal. Actually, coal is the major export in Mongolia, mostly to China, but it's also for domestic use. And really interesting is most of the energy for the entire country is produced in the city, the capital city where everyone lives. And really poor planning, it's upstream, upwind of where most people live. So just thank Soviets for putting the power plant where you did, because it makes the city have really, really bad air quality in the wintertime. So this is just an average day in the winter. Terrible, terrible, terrible air quality. And what's interesting, I think, about this is the air quality is always blamed on the Gare district. People in the city say, oh, it's just because the people living in the Gare district, the poor people, they're burning wood or they're burning coal, and they don't stop to think about the massive amount of energy that's produced in the power plants or the huge, huge numbers of idling cars because traffic takes hours to get anywhere in the wintertime. Because it's so cold, you don't want to walk anywhere. So you're just stuck in traffic for hours. But the discourse in politics and newspaper and everything is blaming the Gare district instead of trying to look at their own culpability in the issues. Sorry, let me find my place here. So there's tons of programs now kind of targeting the Gare district and trying to look at better insulation or improved coal, but not really looking at systemic change. And Mongolia has huge potential for solar energy or wind energy, but instead it's just really status quo. So how that kind of fits into this idea of Oasis or Mirage, trying to tie back to my proposed title. It's a promise of an oasis, but really there is this huge mirage reality that there's severe environmental challenges and that poses immense health risks to kids especially. And then just this perpetuation of poverty and social inequality. Okay, so I want us to think a minute then just like about this idea of Oasis and Mirage. Is this even like a useful way to think about things? And of course I'll say like, yeah, it's brilliant, isn't that? But actually I think it could be a kind of an interesting idea to play with. And I've just listed 5 reasons here that I'll read briefly to you. When I was putting together this talk, I was just thinking like, wow, this concept really applies literally in some places, but then metaphorically it really relates, especially in dryland cities. And then especially thinking about sustainability challenges, there's just such a promise of like, oh, technology will save us and we'll live in these amazing, sustainable urban places in the future. But is that true? Who is going to live there? Who has access to it? Who's going to bear the cost of all of those developments? Also, just thinking about the local context is so important in sustainability, which goes back to this idea of water systems being basically the same in Niamey and Ulaanbaatar, but it doesn't work really for every place. Like, what about the local context? Should a place that's dealing with extreme heat and a place dealing with extreme cold have the same solution? Probably not. But that's how global policy works. You're just, okay, we're just gonna cookie cutter paste these things everywhere. Okay, so I'm gonna try to answer the question that I started with, kind of this slideshow, like what is the imperative? Why is it imperative to ensure that we have these sustainable cities? First, global impact is huge. And drylands, these are places you might not consider a lot, but it actually covers 40% of the earth. So how we develop these regions has a huge impact for global climate, food security, potential migration, really big questions. The question in everyone's mind that especially relates, I think, to the topic at hand of the Ethics Week is how do we develop just futures? How do we have fair futures for everyone? Can a fair world be accessible to all, especially in this phase of climate change, when these dryland areas are a lot of times on the front lines of environmental change? And Mongolia, for example, has experienced about a 2 degrees warming already, higher than global average. So lots of interesting issues from that. Like I mentioned before, these areas are just experiencing a lot of population growth. And if we don't kind of figure out real sustainability issues, there can just be widespread poverty, really bad living conditions. And maybe you don't care about other people, but hopefully you do. It also, I think, has a huge impact on us in the US. There's potential for security issues, potentials for civil unrest in areas, and we're always concerned about how that's going to affect us in foreign policy and where we kind of intervene politically. So maybe you're like, I don't care about these distant places like Mongolia and Niger, but I would argue you should. And maybe you remember the news 7 or 8 years ago that actually there were US forces killed in Niger. We're active there militarily, at least we were until they kicked us out about a month ago. And the theme of this week is really thinking forward, thinking about future generations, and that's really the crux of climate change. And sustainability is we're not doing this necessarily for us now, but how are we leaving the world a better place for people all over the world, but also our own places. That's the end of my lecture, and thank you for coming. I know it was a lot. I know it was a lot to listen to, but yes, thank you so much for your attention. I can move if that's distracting to have that.
We have a few minutes for Q&A. We'll have a mic coming around. So if you don't mind waiting for the mic, if you have a question, that'd be great.
That was wonderful. I've done work with you in Senegal in the past. I was wondering, how did the people, the community there in Gare and others responded to you when you interviewed them, dealing with sustainability, environmental issues, or justice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's always something I think about as a researcher, going to these distant places, because I'm like clearly a white American and I don't blend in, especially in like Niger, but also in Mongolia, you know, like traipsing around. And yeah, I think people are suspicious. That's why I found the usefulness of working with the NGOs, because they could introduce me to their clients. So kind of people that they work with or provide services. And that was part of my PhD training too, was that you should always work with local experts doing the work already. Just because you're American or like, it doesn't mean you have better ideas. There's people there already doing the work probably better than you ever will. So it's really important to partner with like local academics and local experts. Yeah, so I publish a lot with local collaborators from different countries. Yeah, that's something like really important to do. Yeah, because otherwise I'm just gonna get some like fake understanding of things, you know? Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. How do you get involved in these kind of projects without getting a PhD?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Actually, after undergrad, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. If you don't know what that is, that's a federal government program where you apply and you live abroad somewhere for a couple years. It doesn't cost anything. They cover everything. There are Peace Corps volunteers in Mongolia. I met them and I was like, I should do this instead of going back to work. But I would highly recommend, if you're interested in like international work, to check out Peace Corps. It's a 2-year commitment, but they cover like all the costs and you can apply to lots of different countries and programs. That's what set me on my whole path of international work. And so I lived in a village in West Africa for 2 years when I was like my early 20s. It was magical. There was no cell phones, no electricity. It was just beautiful. Yeah.
There will be a Peace Corps volunteer or Peace Corps recruiter on campus tomorrow
Perfect
at the Study
timing.
Abroad Expo
Amazing.
in the LA Concourse from 10 to 2.
That was a planted question. That was perfect.
When you were in Mongolia and were studying like the Gare district,
Yeah.
and how did you notice that like land was divided up? Like, is it any similar to like the poverty areas here in America?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that was like a really big difference actually between between Niger and the Gare district, like Mongolia. So a lot of like around the world, a lot of these informal districts, they are illegal. They don't have legal land ownership, so they can be basically kicked off at any time. But the government of Mongolia recognized like, oh, people are moving here. So they changed the land ownership laws. I think it was like 10 years ago. So all this land is officially owned by people, but you have kind of the same thing like you do here, that people will buy up plots of land and rent them out to people. So I knew like a friend, she actually like helped clean my house. I know that sounds bad, but she lived in the Gare district and she told me one time like, oh, my landlord's making me move. So she had to pack up her Gare and find another plot of land to rent out. Since there is no like network infrastructure, means like there's electricity, but there's no heating or there's no like water, wastewater, there's none of that. So people can kind of move around easier. And then there are some areas just far out that if you can't afford to pay rent, you just kind of put your Gare up and live there. There's not very many schools in this area, so even though there's a bunch of kids that live here, that's one of like the major problems, that and like sanitation. So it's different poverty than the US for sure. Most people have electricity here, but they don't have heat or sanitation. Does that answer-ish? Yeah, okay.
I'm curious, based on what you have personally observed and researched, what you think are the best steps to kind of redistribute in an equitable and just way, like sustainable practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think first you have to look for like the most marginalized people in your communities and start with them. Say like, how are our urban plans gonna affect you? And that might mean like you have to speak different languages or like approach things differently. But if you want to have like real systemic issues, that's where you need to look first. Is like, who are the most marginalized people in my communities? What are their challenges? Like related to the environment in Orem, you might say like, actually like a lot of folks have lawns and are spending a ton of money on that because it's really expensive to convert to like more environmentally friendly places, or it's expensive to learn how to garden. Like how can you have programs that address needs of people like in reality rather than just like a cutesy feel-good program? That's hard though, it takes a long time and it doesn't make money. So it's the way our like market, if you live in Orem, it's like the most market-driven city I've ever lived in. And it doesn't, people don't care. But that's why you gotta get involved and run for city council, like I'm gonna do someday. Oh no, don't clap. I'm a little bit off. Yeah.
This might be a dumb question, I don't know.
Never.
But it's about the water kiosks.
Yeah.
So the people that use those,
Yeah.
do they have to pay for the water?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I should have said that. Yeah, you have to pay for it.
Okay.
It's not free.
So that's how it's funded, is it's not like government or global help, it's you pay for the water.
You pay for the water, but actually they are like city, it's like a government fund, like the government will like build the kiosk.
Okay.
And then, yeah, you have to pay for it every time. So then you can imagine like, it's just, what a pain to like pay for every piece of water. And then if you're, maybe you work in the informal economy and so you know like, oh, next week I have this big project, I'm gonna have money then, but I don't have money now. Like, how does that work with paying for things? So there's a lot of interesting social relationships around paying for water. Yeah, that's a good question.
Sorry. On the note of the water kiosks, you mentioned that they had business hours. How does that affect access to water?
That's such a good question. And that came out actually in the interviews when I was asking, like, what do you wish would change? Because most of them close at 7 or 8 p.m. and all of them are closed on Wednesdays. So, like, hope you don't need water on a Wednesday, because you won't find it, but people know how to plan ahead. But folks were saying that they wish they were open later because the traffic is so bad that if they work in the city, they get home when the water kiosk is already closed. So maybe they have to have their kids home from school the next day so they can wait and get water. And also think about like in the winter, the air quality is so bad, you have to walk outside just to get this like thing that you need to be alive. It's a huge environmental justice risk.
I guess I have two questions, but maybe I'll just ask one. So how do they manage the water that they get in the wintertime, given the cold temperatures?
Yeah.
And does that limit how much they can take and how frequently they have to go?
Yeah, so most people have water storage like inside and outside, but in the winter they can only use their inside water storage because it's a little warmer inside. So yeah, they end up having to go almost every day, depending on how many kids they have and stuff. Yeah, but they have to go more frequently in the winter when it's harder to go there, but they can't store as much. Because if you put it out in the summer, you can just have like water storage outside, no big deal. Yeah, that's a really good question.
So with, land surface, 40%, right, over dry lands, but
Yeah.
dry lands also host over 60% of our food production globally, right? And so I'm trying to think about the connections here about these sprawling cities and how do they access food, and are they growing their own food? Because then they have to budget that in their water within that urban city. So that's, I'm curious about that more.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. And I haven't looked at that like at all. I know in Mongolia, like 40% of the water in the city goes to energy production. And right now it's like culinary water, so which just means like treated water, because they don't have a recycling system or something. Actually, the US government is building one, like as part of international aid and development, but that will build a water recycling so they can put the clean water towards like people. And there's so much air pollution that I think food production would be really hard, like, because there's so much potential metals. I don't know, y'all study that. Eddie studies that. Yeah, but there's not like a tradition of like urban farming in these places that I've seen.
Really interesting stuff. Thinking a little bit more about the heat and the like Gare district. Did you learn anything about like the fuels that they would use? Because I know it's pretty common in some areas in this part of the world to burn dung, and that's like really like a really dirty source. So I don't know. Did you learn?
Yeah, I learned a little bit about that. In the countryside, that's for sure what people use. But in the city, actually, most of the time they use coal, like charcoal, which you buy. And they had some programs to try to have like cleaner charcoal. But then it was this like scandal because it was from China and like someone was bought off that it wasn't actually clean coal. And I don't know, there was all these scandals around actually, is it making any difference? But if you can't, and that, you have to buy that, right? So if you can't afford to buy like a bag of charcoal, then you burn wood or rubber or whatever you have. So it really depends on like poverty. And there's a really beautiful film that hopefully we can bring to UVU sometime called If Only I Could Hibernate, about kids in the Gare district who are trying to like support themselves. And they show that like kind of the struggle of finding what to burn. But I stayed in a Gare in the winter. You have to put like something on the fire all night. It gets really, like really cold. Yeah, so most of the time it's charcoal, if you can afford it. Good question.
The local NGOs that you worked with, what kinds of programs and projects are they working on right now?
That's a good question. Most of them were education, and they ran kindergartens or elementary schools because there aren't really any in the Gare district. There's maybe like one or two, but there's such a demand for those. So most of the time the NGOs are running those. They don't have anything to do with water. They're like, why do you want to know that? That's weird. Yeah, most of the time it's education.
So I was wondering, for cooking, people also use charcoal or just biomass mainly?
Oh yeah, in the city they have it's like a stove in the middle that's kind of your heating and your cooking all in one. So charcoal for that too. But that's scary then because it gets really hot, you know? So if you're in there, you have to be really careful. It terrified me when my kids were with me because it would melt your clothes. It was so hot, but you wanted it because it was so cold. Yeah, that's another thing. Like, how is air quality and just cooking related? That'd be a really interesting study.
One more question.
I get to ask two. So you mentioned the importance of trees in Niamey, and I was curious about the type of tree. You said that they didn't use fruit trees. Was that because it was more of a native tree that didn't require as much water, was one part of the question. And then the other part I was going to ask is there a similar kind of environmental amenity that promotes meeting amongst the community members in Ulaanbaatar?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the time, people had like acacia trees in the poor neighborhoods or neem trees, like things that had other uses, not just. I thought they would have fruit trees. Like, wouldn't that make sense? You'd want to have like something that could supplement your food supply, but no, that wasn't really the thought. And I think they're faster growing. I don't know, maybe need less water. Maybe that's a Tara question. And in Mongolia was surprising for me because there's like not that many trees there. Like you go to the countryside and it's just these rolling grassland, short grasses, steppe. And maybe if you're in mountainous areas, there's trees, but there's just not a cultural like connection with trees in the same way. It's more like the blue sky and rivers and a lot of cultural ideas around how you're supposed to use water and connection to like this blue sky. But like trees are hardly like a thing in Mongolian culture, which fascinated me. Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you all for coming. See you again.